as well. To the extent that we can keep neighborhood character and identity, to the extent that the city can support folks who have invested and who are there, what you end up getting is not a gigantic super center of some sort that comes in and changes the face of everything. Instead, it's actually having this opportunity to say we can support these businesses ongoing, and right, you kind of keep the same character. It's not this sort of replacement idea. I think another thing that we can do that's helpful is, and I had a grandmother who had this experience, etc. It's making sure that folks can stay in the homes that they're in now. So when you have, and many of you live in homes like these, when you have an older home, an historic home, or anything of that sort, you're worried about utilities, your repairs are very expensive, you've got, thankfully we don't have to pay for the sidewalk repairs right in front anymore, but there are just a lot of costs. And to the extent that we can give people an opportunity to remain where they are, without saying, this is $10,000 too far for me, and I gotta go, then you have a real opportunity. And frankly, I mentioned the senior citizen example, but that was the experience my family had when I was growing up. Had a single mother, and we lived in this beautiful big house for a little while, and she couldn't pay for it. She couldn't afford it. And it wasn't necessarily because of the rent we were paying or anything like that. It was because of the mix of utilities, the repairs, the fact that you need to get a hot water tank at some point, all of those. So to the extent that we can create more opportunities, or frankly expose people to opportunities that allow them to stay, then I think that's what we have. And another part of this question is, are you as elected officials committed to taking action to do this? I think the answer is clearly yes. I grew up in Kansas City, a lot of us on this panel did. What I don't want to see Kansas City have years from now, because if you go to far stretches of South Kansas City, Ruskin Heights and others, or if you go to parts of the Northland, you see the fact that us leapfrogging away from our problems is not a long-term solution. And the other problem for Kansas City, Missouri is people often leapfrog their way out of town. And what I'd like to see us do is say, look, we have a solution that allows you to stay in your community, because frankly, a lot of those leapfrog subdivisions of the 1960s, we now see having lots of issues. Frankly, that's part of our housing policy conversation too, that don't have the same positives that we have here in the Northeast. And so I'd like to make sure we're impactful on that too.
All right, it's all your all's turn, so do you have a question, Nate?
I was want to piggyback what he said, but I seen something on television. It was in Brazil, but they had some students that came in from Spain and painted this real big housing apartment, you know, different bright colors, and they also incorporated gardening in the whole apartment building. So I would like to maybe see a multiple family of housing. You know, low-income housing, and they incorporated the garden idea and had compost, and everybody in the whole building grew food.
Can I just say something this has a lot to do with your question?
Mm-hmm.
How old are you? By the middle of frontier? 7. All right, my daughter's 7, so might be. She liked this when she was 6. There's a book called The Great Orange Splot, or The Big Orange Splot. And it is exactly what you were talking about, except it's a kid's story about a seagull that dropped a thing of paint on someone's house, and then the entire neighborhood started putting murals and their dreams.
And all these students, they volunteered to paint. I mean, you know, what I was saying, when you were saying about a multi-family thing. You know.
I mean, I just want to say arts is really important, and arts is a place where people can come together. Gardening is a place where people can come together. The more you can find places where people of different incomes, different races, different whatever, can come together in a neighborhood, it makes that neighborhood more cohesive and more balanced in the long term. And I think what you're expressing is beautiful. So I'm into that. Sorry.
Take it. I'm just going to kind of go start with you. I saw your hand.
Oh, thanks. Okay, so I'd like to talk about money. And money seems to be the bottom line of all of this. And obviously, you know, people are saying people want their price to increase, and then you want to have better facilities. But I see what we do a lot in Kansas City, and you started to speak to this a little bit, Councilman Lucas, is that we have been doing a lot of things to privilege the very wealthy in the city. And for one reason or another, because of loopholes or tax abatements or special incentives, those people on the wealthier end end up actually paying very little back to our city. And on the other end of this conversation, we're talking about doing things in neighborhoods where poor people live, where they're scrambling to get facilities that they should have all along just because of human decency. And these shouldn't be things that are putting up the value of property in the neighborhoods. They should be things that everybody has just as a human right. So we're talking about this different set of values, and it seems like the city is still maintaining. You say that we're moving away from them, but I see what's happening in downtown in the Crossroads area right now. And these are incentives that are continually going to these high-end developments. And this is money that, I know the argument is that this is potential income that has been diverted rather than actual income. But if that diversion didn't happen, it would be real income. And it would be real income that could be used in the neighborhoods where this kind of development is really needed without the repercussions that come onto the heads of all the people who live there. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like we keep thinking in this small pie instead of how is the pie made bigger so that we don't have to keep cutting smaller slices for people who don't have so much.
I got it. All right. I opened a can of worms with it. And you're absolutely right. And there was a reason I specifically said on the plaza, because that's the only place that we've seen people asking for incentives less. You're certainly right to note that downtown, the Crossroads, Crown Center, River Market, we continue to get that same type of request. Here's how I usually answer this. The way I see that the city's policy existed for a long time in terms of how we were building was purely this idea of blight remediation. And the problem is that blight ended up becoming everything. This room is blighted, my hair is blighted, I don't have much. We've made it so, and I think part of the problem is, this is why I appreciate the neighborhood housing services study, was because they actually answered the question of what is it that we're trying to do with housing policy. Because the problem with all of these apartment buildings that are being built, everything that you're talking about is, yeah, we're still saying, oh, well, it's a parking lot that's underutilized now. There's economic blight, right? In fact, that happens a lot. And so to challenge that and to change that, well, we need our good policy conversations like this and good policies. But I actually have to ask a favor of all of you. And this is the thing, because I told you the story about how when Scott Wagner goes to the grocery store, they say, great job, Scott, you have a big shiny project. They don't say, great job, Scott, there are 10 single-family homes in southern Clay County that are still there now, and nobody's written a newspaper story about it. So whenever you're thinking about, when you see us come visit you, or in your neighborhood associations, or anything of that sort, say, how is it that we're actually building the community? It can't just be us looking at the home runs all the time. That's how we have Cordish doing all these big towers. Because in the 1990s, and I was much younger then, so I won't quibble with the choices they made, but they said, we all were, I guess, but they made the choice of saying, right, we want to have these things that will make our downtown dynamic, that will make our city dynamic and interesting. And the problem is that 20 years later, maybe it's the time that we need to say, well, that's not everything. And we need to get back to quality of life, and we still want a Kansas City that works for Kansas Cityans. And so that's how we do it. The other thing that you have to remember is be vocal, be loud. Because, yeah, every day, big development interests do have their lawyers that come and try to find us. I try to avoid them and they find us. They hang out in the hallways, they're getting paid to do all that sort of stuff.
I put a tracer on you.
Right. So it's really making sure that we're saying that's what neighborhoods, housing opportunities for people that may not be like us are key. Frankly, one of the best things I've learned from this gentleman is he's got me up to the Northland a lot more. I'm not from there. But I've learned a heck of a lot more about housing needs at Northwest 72nd Street than I ever knew existed. And so I think that's what we need to think about when we're pushing policy long term. People do care, maybe we just need to channel in how they can care more.
Can I saw a lot of hands.
Sorry.
So I wanna-
One of the things I've heard a lot about, or not heard much about, is the larger investors that have 10, 20, some of them 30 or 40 houses. They don't even live in town here. They have no incentive to keep these houses rented. They may have a third of their home rented. The rest are sitting there. It improves the opportunities for the homeless to make money. Not legally, but it does improve it. Is there anything being done to enforce incentives to keep these houses and people in? There's an opportunity there, I think, for affordable housing, rather than fine for not having a house rented.
I just want to say something really quickly about Echoes, because this is, so in 2009, 10, 11, 12, I managed a program where we acquired and renovated homes, 100 homes in a community right outside of Chicago. I mean, people's lives, people who took out bad loans, people who, investors just like this, who bought homes and then gave up at the, smallest sign of trouble. It's a real problem in cities, outside investors who aren't really putting much into properties, people that buy homes.
Clean them up.
Huh?
They're wanting to clean them up.
So, I mean, I don't have an answer, but it scares me hearing stuff like that, because I remember picking up the pieces of people's lives in some of these houses. I mean, I remember a girl's room, the first house we sold, when I went in there, there was a picture of Hannah Montana on the wall. It looked like she'd left, like, in the middle of the night when property was lost to the bank. Just, I hate hearing about these outside groups, because it's a real problem.
So, I'll come at it from a couple of ways. One of the things is that we've tried to develop more and more tools to put pressure on property owners to keep their properties updated. We have our regular codes enforcement on the outside. We now have what has been passed related to healthy homes inspection. The hope is that if you tell someone to keep up your property enough, well, the way they can afford to do that is putting someone in their property to live there, right? But there are those that don't do that anyway. The problem is, quite honestly, that there is very little power for us to say, put someone in that house. What makes it even more difficult is that if we wanted to, for example, say, there's nothing going on at this house, we might as well, as the city, take the house and give it to someone who will use it for a better purpose. The state of Missouri's property laws are some of the, I won't call them the worst, I'll just say what they do is they place a high value on the property owner, and they make it very difficult for us to take a property. It's for that same reason when it's clearly abandoned, yet someone is still paying the property tax, we have very little ability to go get them. And we have thousands more properties that are of that ilk than what actually we have possession of through land bank. So having said all of that, what I would tell you is that part of what I guess I would ask the organization to consider and to do is to come to us when it's time for us to figure out what do we want to do for our policy related to Jefferson City, and what to ask for in the next state legislative session, to ask for some laws to help us deal with that. And I'll say that, don't lose hope on that approach, because, and John knows this, John Wood knows this, we spent, 3 years getting LLC legislation through that at least allowed us finally to force someone to identify who is taking care of your property. So we at least have someone to go to. And that's only a year old, and we'll see how ultimately, how successful that is. But it can happen. No one says anything happens in Jeff City, but it can happen. But that's really the best way we could really start to deal with that.
Let me just add, I think what you just said, I think we can perform stronger and more vigorous and more aggressive code enforcement. Problem is, if these folks are out of town, then they will ignore us. You can't bring them to justice.
100 tickets doesn't
But I think that what Mayor Pro Tem Wagner just indicated, is if we had a strongly worded legislative directive that we can then take to Jefferson City. It might take us 3 years to get it done, but I believe the state of Ohio has such a law where they can actually place liens on such properties and foreclose on those properties to force the hand of the owners. And I think that's what we need to have.
Yeah.
One of the things I was thinking of myself personally, I don't know how effective it would be, an empty house should be taxed higher.
Should be what?
Which would be under city control.
Taxed higher, you said.
Yeah.
We're gonna
If you
move.
can afford to leave it sit there, then you can afford more tax.
Right.
And I think legal aid had discussed, and I haven't heard it in
I mean, I don't
probably
know.
2 or 3 years, but there was, I think, some discussion on kind of incentivizing a use of a property as opposed, to letting it sit. Again, you kind of get into these property rights issues with the state, and that's where your roadblock is.
I just know that there's a large part of Northeast.
You're right,
Thank
absolutely
you,
right.
thank you, gentlemen. We'll move to the question in the back over here.
And I think a lot of people had already spoke on it, Mayor Pro Tem and Councilman Lucas, and they know usually I don't get out of a lot of these meetings, but I'm really concerned because I have a lot of people that are homeless, like they said, staying in hotels, paying for them, and they could be somewhere else. I have 3 calls last week, 3 this week, and look up, they're gonna have to, be put somewhere. We don't have enough shelter, none of that. And gentrification has already started. We got rent going up, lights going up, water, gas, food, medicine, property tax, life insurance. I have some of my elders getting ready to sell their cars because they can't afford their life insurance. It's either the car insurance, the car, housing, all that. Met with some of them. I went into a senior citizen building, 3 of them, Saturday to discuss something else. And I have 100-year-old on down, saying, hey, this is what's happening, da-da-da-da. They feel they're gonna be pushed out. So it's back to what you said, that we need to fight, you know what I'm saying? So I'm like, why we couldn't have went, because I'm not the business part, but why we didn't go with the mixed housing before we went with the houses that people that already have the money to be able to afford it? Why did we go with the ones that can afford $1,000 on up before we thought about doing the mixed housing, which is affecting the little people? And then I'm gonna be honest with that, just my thinking, I believe if we'd have did some of that, we'd have weeded out a lot of this violence and a lot of other stuff going on. Just my opinion.
Actually, I have a comment on that. So I don't have a solution for what you're saying, but I do want to share kind of like from the inside the industry perspective on how I see that on a daily basis. I also do property management, and I get inquiries all the time from people looking for apartments to rent. And it's fairly standard for a property owner to not even consider someone to even look at a unit if they can't show that they make 3 times the rent amount. So if I get an inquiry from someone who is honest and upfront and says, I'm homeless, I'm living in my car, and I can see from their application that they make, half of, of what the, or double the rent, sorry, they'd be spending half of their income on the rent. My client, who is the owner of the building, doesn't even want me to consider that person at all. And so every time I hear someone's really honest, tragic story, I have a surgery coming up, I have to find a place before that so I can recover safely, or I'm about to lose my place, or this or that, that hurts them far more than it helps them. And I, as a property manager, don't have the authority to help that person. I have to respond to the needs of my client, who is the property owner. So, I wish we had a solution for that, but for most landlords and property owners, it does come down to the dollar amount, their return on their investment, and the risk that they're taking by renting to someone who is very upfront saying, essentially from a business perspective, that person is saying, I'm not stable or reliable. And like, for me as a person, that is not how I see, this other person's struggle. But when my entire job is based on, delivering a reliable rent-paying tenant, I feel very caught in that situation a lot of the time. I don't know what the solution is, but it is a huge problem. I get way more inquiries from people looking for rentals that cannot afford what I have available than I do from people who can afford it. It's like I'm having a struggle renting these units. They're like $8,000, $9,000 a month. And I'm getting tons and tons of calls from people who want something that's 300, 400, 500. So that it's a huge problem.
But I mean, for them to buy the houses, I hear what you know, I'm wanting where, because we had even redlining done here in Kansas City. I had to learn what that was about.
Yes.
But I'm saying, I would love to see some of them be able to buy, but they can't, not at no, $1,000 a month. I had, and the reason why I really came out today, I had one trying to commit suicide last week, and I get the calls on 71, because she can't afford a house. And I know some people probably like, okay, whatever, now. These are still all of us supporting each other. You know what I'm saying? The young lady that stopped the shooting up there in the grocery store, neighborhood lady, that, I don't know if y'all seen it, they was shooting, 15-year-old got shot, it was a lady. We cannot say her name right now because we don't know who's still looking. But she picked up the gun and pulled it on other people. Guess what? She had to leave her home because of that, because the guy seen her, So it's because she's scared. So, and she can afford, these are working people I'm talking about.
Yeah,
So I'm just
absolutely.
like, I wish they could be able to buy a home or, go that route. I talked to John about it earlier. So I'm hoping we get something done.
I would just say people who are paying rent, not every person who wants to, who's renting needs to own a house, needs to own. I mean, some people
Right.
like to be a renter, some people like to be an owner. There are a lot of people who want to be an owner, but one of the barriers, they don't understand what the process is to get there. A lot of people who are paying rent, who are paying $1,000, $1,200 to these folks who own these single-family homes, if they understood the process of home ownership, they could afford a house and pay half of what they're paying in a mortgage payment than what they're paying currently in rent. But part of it is an educational process, letting people understand what that process is and helping them overcome the fear factor, which is a barrier of home ownership.
So, regarding the housing trust fund that you guys are talking about, when will that go into effect, or is that in effect?
So short answer, it was introduced by ordinance maybe a month ago. We need to still debate it, and so it will be a little while.
So one of the biggest barriers to homeownership for low-income families is down payment assistance. So will that housing trust fund have down payment assistance in that? Is that something that you guys are talking about? Also, will it have additional housing choice vouchers in it? Because I know that list has been depleted forever, so.
So I think what at least we've drafted in there, the ordinance is a bit detailed. In terms of housing choice vouchers, I believe we'll leave that to staff to determine how exactly they would.
Yeah, the draft, there's actually a draft that you can look at. You could go to kcmo.gov under Neighborhood Housing Services. So there's a PDF form, but there's a voucher concept that's outlined in there. The Public Housing Authority was actually part of the stakeholder group that as well as TARD and other folks. But then we also talked about barriers, which is a whole section devoted to what some of those barriers are, and then how to overcome those barriers. Down payment assistance is one of the most successful programs we've had over the years, but we haven't funded it for the last 2 or 3 years. Has been the Kansas City Dream program, which we offered a $20,000 and or some number to help homeowners get into a house and work with banks to make that happen. One of the things we talked about in the housing policy is to reintroduce that program, maybe even in this upcoming CDBG home action plan, to put some money in there for that program again.
And that would go towards down payment assistance,
Right.
or would that actually help them, a family that's 60% AMI is gonna have some issues with a mortgage on a $120,000-$150,000 house. So,
Agreed.
is there some help in there for helping them pay down that principal?
So the program was a down payment assistance and closing cost assistance type program, and it was up to $20,000. That helped a lot of families. Now, people who are on the lower end of that, of the income strata, I can't guarantee you that they're going to be assisted that way, except that, again, on the issue of housing rehabilitation, you can rehabilitate a house and remodel it at least to the point of making it very livable, for about $50,000-$60,000. If you spread that out over 30 years, you're looking at a $300 or $400 house payment.
Yeah, I like that.
That's affordable.
Definitely. And then one more question, and I'll shut up, is I know Councilman Lucas was talking about not worrying about, people that are making 100% of AMI, but I think having some idea of what the market is, there seems to be a big donut hole for the 60% AMI to 140% AMI. Can you guys speak to that and how that might actually, what the city is doing to address those housing?
Yeah, I think a few things. One of the policies that we did before we even got into this was a market value analysis that looked at the housing market in our city for everyone. Every neighborhood, how it's breaking down, do we have enough opportunities? Because if the city's actually working, so I wasn't being serious enough. If the city's working, we have housing opportunities for everyone who wants to live in Kansas City, from the millionaire to the zeroaire, right? And so the idea is that we're trying to make sure opportunities exist for people to be throughout our different neighborhoods. In terms of policy solutions for that, it's multifaceted. Whereas we're having probably a direct housing policy conversation in terms of where we need to do real unit creation, which will be those that are sitting at 60%, 40%, 20% AMI. In terms of those who are above, who are at 100%, we're actually thinking about how do we create good opportunities for them, because that is a regular middle class income.
They can't afford $1,800 a month in rent.
Right, that's absolutely right. So that's why we passed an ordinance to make it so it was actually set at them. So really, there is an ordinance for them. And then we're also trying to make sure we're creating enough quality of life opportunities that Kansas City remains affordable, understanding that there are additional costs or challenges.
What do you mean quality of life?
I'm going to that. Utilities, right, would being one example. Proximity to transportation, actually proximity to food, so you're not in food deserts, that sort of thing. Recognizing that even if you are making let's say a $40,000 per year salary, a $30,000 per year salary, and perhaps, as we've noted before, your income may be able to match well with the housing unit you're in, there still may be attendant costs. My sister's one of those people who makes $10 an hour at the Jackson County Courthouse, lives the east side of 3rd District, right, and tries to drive in every day. As you know, as we all would know, her car breaks down one day, that's an issue, and transit hasn't really been enhanced. So that's why, although we're talking housing policy, we've tried to be holistic in how it relates to transportation, and there's a reason the councilman mentions utility costs, water and sewer rates, etc. So I'd say that's kind of our multifaceted way to do it, but we're not ignoring folks who are at 100% or 80% in connection with the policy. I think he's
There's an aspect of this that I think is incredibly important as we talk about this trust fund. A few minutes ago we talked about how if I'm above 80% AMI, I do not have access to some of the federal funds that we use. It's a limiter for that very reason. And so as we talk about a $75 million trust fund, and we've got a colleague who wants to do a $10 million trust fund, and everyone wants a trust fund. I want a trust fund, but I'm never going to get one. But the issue is source of funds. Because we have a heavy reliance on federal funds to do the work that we do, and they have limits.
And that's where that trust fund money is?
So the idea is develop a fund whose source is not federal in nature, so that you have the maximum flexibility to be able to help someone at 60% or 80% or 100% or 140% or whatever the case may be. But that's where it's going to get interesting. And I mention this because my good friend and colleague here had the audacity, and it was really cool, but it was the audacity to say within that $75 million fund that maybe we want to access some of that 1/8 cent Central City tax to be used for residential. And I told him this, but I stuck my name on it anyway, just for the fun of it, that there are those who are going to say, nope, that's not for housing, it's for commercial development along that corridor. And so the question becomes, how do you have a strong corridor if you don't consider housing in that discussion, right? But I know when it comes up and it's time for people to talk about it, there are going to be a lot of people saying, nope, that's money for this purpose and it's not for the use of housing. And if you start to then go to other things, like I'll again look at John, who has spent years trying to get the private sector, banks and otherwise, to invest in just $5 million, which has proved to be very challenging. So pay very close attention when that discussion really starts to go, because you will find people who will say, that's a great idea, but I don't want to use that money that way, which then may get into other options, whether it's taxing and otherwise. So just wanted to make sure to mention that.
One of the rules of development is that you can't have successful commercial development if you don't have rooftops. Because commercial developers are people who are building businesses, etc. Where are the people going to come from that are buying their goods and services?
Right.
Well, preferably they're next door, a couple blocks away, along the Prospect Corridor, or some of these major corridors like Independence. But you can't have successful commercial development unless you have these rooftops. So the housing policy partially looks at how do we bring more people and attract more people in these neighborhoods along these corridors, create more density, so then the small businesses and the commercial development that these folks want can thrive and be successful.
Okay, so we have 5 more minutes of questions, so this might be our last one, but Chris?
So, just in regards to federal policy, and just as policymakers and also as a developer, what do you think about opportunity zones? I guess once the federal government figures that out, I guess is that a good tool for Kansas City?
So myself and 2 other people at City Hall, including the EDC and Bob's folks over there, have been working on opportunity zones within the Kansas City area. Our zones have been set by the Department of Economic Development and sent to the governor for his approval. So those zones are set. I think it is a great opportunity to get monies into housing and commercial development. Is a way to do it without all the strings. However, the zones because we only had 161 zones that could be approved across the state, we were lucky enough to get 30 of those zones. So it's not all across the city, but within those zones, there's an opportunity for that money to flow into those areas. However, we have to be very, very careful who we are asking to come into the city to do these particular developments. And so I would say we're cautiously optimistic now about how we're going to do that, and we're hoping to be able to invite folks in that have